Ladies and gentlemen, we now continue with session 3. My esteemed colleague, Mr. Popov, will now present the participants for session 3 in a minute. Thank you.
Okay, ladies and gentlemen, now we are continuing with the third session, the session of the CSDP. And I would like to remind the topic of the session. The topic is the implementation of the EU global strategy. And according to the program, I suggest to focus on strengthening EU-NATO cooperation, the further development of the EU defense capabilities, cyber defense and strategic communications. It is expected that the coordinated annual defense review and the capability development plan will help for the development of the EU defense capabilities and to identify new areas for joint projects in the framework of the permanent structured cooperation. Work on the European Defence Fund and the adaptation of the regulations of the European Defence Industrial Development Programme is ongoing. They should create opportunities that all EU member states could be involved in projects. Incentives for the participation of the small and medium enterprises need to be put in place. In the context of the modern security challenges, cyber defense and strategic communications get growing importance. And to stimulate our discussion on these or other important topics, we have 4 distinguished panelists that I would like to introduce. Mr. Gabor Ikludi is European External Action Service Director for Crisis Management and Planning Directorate since June 2014. Before that, he has served as a NATO Assistant Secretary General for Emerging Security Challenges, Political Director and State Secretary in the Hungarian Foreign Ministry, and 2 terms as Ambassador in Norway and Sweden. Mr. Mihnea Motok is Deputy Head of the European Policy Strategy Center. He was Minister of the National Defense of Romania, Ambassador to Netherlands, Permanent Representative to United Nations, and to the European Union. Mr. Boyko Noev has served as Bulgarian Deputy Minister of Defense and Minister of Defense 2 times. He was a Bulgarian ambassador to NATO, Belgium and Luxembourg, member and deputy head of the Bulgarian delegation to the OSCE. Professor Todor Tagarev is head of the Center of the Security and Defense Management, Bulgarian Academy of Science. He served as a defense minister and took number of the posts in the Bulgarian Ministry of Defense. I would invite our panelists to limit their introductory words for about 5, 6, 7 minutes, but that's all, because probably we'll get a lot of questions. And without further delay, I'll give the floor to Mr. Ikludi for his introductory words. Sir.
Mr. Chairman, thank you very much, and good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Delighted to be here and join this panel. I know that you've had the chance of hearing the High Representative yesterday, who also touched on security and defense matters. And in the interest of time, let me just mention a few things, an introduction, and then very much looking forward to the discussion thereafter. Practically, if I were to simplify things a little bit, what is the purpose of the current rather ambitious defense efforts, security and defense efforts today? I would say it is to make member states start investing more in security and defense, collaborate more, and concentrate a lot more on the actual operational output of these efforts. So today, the exam question practically is Europe ready and willing to start moving towards greater integration in defense matters, or at least enhanced better collaboration and coordination? The success of these efforts will obviously help beef up Europe's defense capacities, but not only. And I think the High Representative touched on this yesterday. It will also obviously reinforce the public trust in the whole European integration process. After a very, very difficult period of time, which President Juncker described as Europe was bruised and battered, so there was time to move on. So it is wider in scope. It may have an impact. It will have an impact on European integration and trust of our public in these efforts. It will have an impact also on the transatlantic burden sharing. So if Europe generates more capabilities, more willing to contribute, then obviously it has a beneficial effect on the transatlantic link as well. And it will also help NATO, because let's not forget, all these capabilities are national capabilities, and thereafter, whenever our countries will have those capabilities, up to them to decide where they want to use it, in an EU context, in NATO context, UN, elsewhere. So what are the problems that we seek to find a fix for? One is indeed related to the resources. After long, long years of decline in defense expenditure and lukewarm political attention, clearly defense is back on the political agendas again in Europe. When PESCO was set up just last December, member states who signed up to it signed up to a commitment to, a legally binding commitment, to start gradually spending more on defense in real terms. Now that's a novum, because that has never happened before in the European Union. In NATO it did, like the Wales commitment, the defense pledge, but not in the European Union before. We also know that it's not only the size of the pie that matters, that is how much money we spend on defense, but how we slice it up. In other words, whether we get really bang for the buck that we spent on defense. The first question there that needs to be addressed, and that's absolutely critical, is the fragmentation of these efforts. Think about the fact that 80% of the money that we spend on defense-related investments are spent nationally, as opposed to generate collaborative projects. McKinsey, for instance, assessed that by procuring defense equipment together, we could save up to 30%. So that's a pretty impressive headroom that we could free up. So fragmentation is absolutely critical. Here, the objective is that we need to help develop collaborative projects, and of course, all these major initiatives, PESCO, CARD, that is the annual review on defense, and in particular EDF, the European Defense Fund, which is yet another game changer in this, in this effort, can help incentivize. Another big question is what we spend our money on. Do we spend our money on shortfalls that are really critical for Europe's defense and the protection of Europe, or we continue letting it be diverted by other considerations, industrial and other? So is it about keeping jobs, maintaining defense industry, or indeed we can start concentrating a lot more on those priorities that are defined as European defense priorities. CARD will be a very important instrument to help us get greater clarity on what is needed and make sure that these efforts are aligned. And lastly, to mention one element, which is, it's great to have equipment, it's great to build capabilities, but the usefulness will remain limited unless there is political will to use them. I know you touched on the battle groups, for instance, which at the time was called the Ferrari in the garage. It's nice to have it, but you never use it. So we have to have the political commitment to use them. PESCO is a vehicle precisely to do that, to help members of the EU who signed up to PESCO to enhance cooperation, to do exactly that, to engage in more demanding missions. This is not the end of the road yet. Of course, we are in the beginning of the process, so a lot of effort the efforts will continue to focus on the implementation of these initiatives, and there are others that are already being outlined, and I know that the High Representative mentioned yesterday the peace facility that can help us fund our own activities, and finally, hopefully, will also help us build capacities in partner countries too. One word on EU-NATO, and then I stop because otherwise it's getting very long. So we are living in a different world today in terms of EU-NATO interaction. It's a lot more practical, it's a lot more pragmatic. It has evolved tremendously over the past 2 years, in particular since Wales. And the trigger was mostly hybrid warfare, because we both have realized that unless we get our act together, we will not be able to lend effective support to our members or allies, for that matter. There are proposals on the table, many of them focuses on implementation. There is a political attention, and we need to go back and report on progress achieved regularly. That's very important to keep the political pressure on. And let me just mention one of the future projects that is very high on the agenda today. Happy to talk more about that. That's military mobility. That's absolutely critical, both for the EU and certainly not less important for NATO. Or to be more precise, these are not EU or NATO matters. These are national matters. How countries, member states and allies will become more capable of delivering on the defense promise, be it collective defense on the NATO side, or indeed manage crises outside Europe more effectively. So that's a very big effort with many challenges further down the road, but that's an effort worth taking. I would stop here. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Ikludi. And our next panelist will be Mr. Matod. Please, sir.
Thank you very much, Chairman. I thank the National Assembly for this gracious and very timely invitation. It's great being here, also exposed to members of the European Parliament that are actively engaged in supporting these evolutions on European defense and security. The previous speaker did not leave much for me to address, but in as far as European defense and security are concerned, maybe just to strengthen some of the points you already made, probably to take a look back on where it all started and say that it's good to remember that it would have taken more time, or it would have not happened the way it happened with PESCO, EDF, CARD, MPCC coming together last year in a quite spectacular fashion if it weren't for the early vision, pioneering vision of President Juncker, who decided to prioritize from the beginning European defense on the political agenda of the Commission. And I would say another important and triggering moment last year was the adoption by the Commission last June of the European defense package, which was, I would say, a fortunate combination of a strategic vision for the future of European defense, the putting together of a fund to fire up that vision, and also a program for boosting European defense industry. Of course, it will take time for all this to produce results, for PESCO, CARD, EDF to translate into concrete achievements. And I'd probably recall some of the challenges immediately ahead. One is, of course, the adoption of legislation in as far as the program on the development of defense industry is concerned. And there I trust very much that the Bulgarian presidency will work smoothly through the trialogues with the European Parliament in order to deliver results on time as we need them. Also, we need to secure adequate and dedicated financing for defense and security policy in the next MFF, and this is not going to be easy, although I think these areas are going to be prioritized accordingly in the proposal, at least in the proposal by the Commission on the next MFF. But the biggest challenge, like already pointed out, to me is getting governmental and industrial actors in our nations to cooperate, to get the reflex of cooperating all across the life cycle of developing military products. That's from defense research to capability development and further down to procurement, to operation, to training and maintenance, and you name them. And this is not going to be easy because some of the habits are deeply entrenched there. And although the promises of greater cooperation are very, very clear, it's not going to be such an easy leap in that direction. What the promise is with not necessarily more money, because we're not asking for spending more necessarily, but for spending better, for spending together with more outcomes. So with not necessarily more money, we would be able to achieve at least four things. One thing would be to fill the present day the capability deficits. The other promise is to keep Europe in the high-stakes global race for developing the military weaponry, the weaponry for future wars. This is going to be extremely costly. We would preserve our defense industrial and technological competitiveness, and ultimately we would be able, only by engaging into this kind of defense cooperation, we would be able to remain an actor that is truly of a global stature and significance. Of course, we are not going to develop and invest in just any capabilities, as we are not going to do that for the sake of merely having capabilities. We have to keep in mind the strategic aims that we define for ourselves from the beginning, and there's many definitions of those strategic aims. I'd say that the easiest one is building up a true European defense union, which our leaders saw as possible to be up and running by 2025. I'd also use the rest of my time to perhaps engage a little bit into the new security challenges and discuss make some general points with regard to cybersecurity and cyber defense. Now, to me, while we are still faced as Europe with the challenge of achieving a common threat assessment and understanding, of achieving a common strategic culture, at least two new threats, new security threats are of relevance and are present and are affecting all of us throughout the European Union. And one is cyber attacks, the other one is fake news and political disinformation. Really, no one in Europe seems to have been spared over the last years from cyber attacks. No country, east, west, north, south, and no private or public sector or activity. Indeed, there are some EU member states in which 50% or even more than 50% of all crimes are cyber crimes. If my memory serves me right, 85% of European companies have already experienced cyber incidents. And let us be very clear, these are reported incidents because not all cyber incidents are reported and not all cyber incidents are acknowledged. People, companies don't even realize sometimes that they have been subjected to such attacks. And of course, losses are immense. On the other hand, indeed, no one in Europe has been shielded from fake news, from political disinformation, manipulation, and interference. On neither of these challenges is the European Union to substitute for the primary responsibilities of member states. What we are only aiming at is doing the strict necessary, what is strictly useful to complement and add value to national efforts. And on cyber, we are doing a lot in terms of cybersecurity. I think the best summary of all that we have been doing and plan to do in that area is the joint communication by the High Representative and the Commission on cybersecurity, which comes with a lot of interesting proposals. It's quite comprehensive, and I say it opens up the consideration at EU level of going beyond cybersecurity, because there is no point in just strengthening our cyber resilience alone if we are not able to back that up by cyber deterrence or even cyber defense in the way that many member states, many countries in Europe are already doing. So the communication takes a distinct interest in the issue of bolstering European abilities to cyber defend and deter. Maybe quickly on fake news and political disinformation, I think there we went from a stage in which we were barely acknowledging the problem to the point now where we tend to see lurking behind every major political event, fake news, political interference. This is a new territory for the agenda of the European Commission and of the EU indeed, but we are taking fast strides in that direction. There will be a comprehensive communication on that coming end of April. This is done in fact under the leadership of the Bulgarian Commissioner Gabriel. And we at the European Political Strategy Center are going to have a hearing on fake news and political disinformation next week, and also publish a strategic paper around it. What we're trying to do is to put a first stone in an EU strategy on this phenomenon. We are already doing a lot in terms of boosting media literacy, and we are already financing new tools for journalists out of Horizon 2020. And there's more ideas to come in that way. I would also end on these new challenges that both cybersecurity and fake news and political disinformation should and will be for sure part of this enhanced cooperation between the European Union and Western Balkans that the new credible enlargement perspective unveiled by the Commission last week will necessarily involve. This is part of the beefed up cooperation that we need in order to to materialize that credible perspective. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Matuk. And now the floor will have Mr. Neuf.
Thank you, General Popov. Thank you for inviting me, and thank Gemma for inviting me to this conference. Let me declare a conflict of interest at the very beginning. I deeply believe in federal Europe, so whatever I'm going to say will probably be biased by that belief of mine. We need to have a federal Europe. That's what I believe in. European defense has been on the agenda for a long time. European defense is even older than NATO. It started in 1948. It didn't materialize because of the French rejection, French Parliament rejection. But it has a long history. And when we speak about PESCO as a new development and as a breakthrough, of course, we remember that PESCO is Article 46 of the Treaty of the European Union, adopted in 2007, 10 years ago. So we are now happy that we have PESCO at last. We did have the advantage of having a safer Europe for a long time, and we had the time to solve security issues, but now we don't have the time anymore. I think that what has already been said, and also by Ms. Mogherini, that credibility of the Union is on the agenda. And what we're discussing now about European defense, this is a major driving force to enhance the credibility of the European Union. And that's why it's very important politically to happen. And number two, we have real threats. We have migration, and it's not by chance that I put migration number one. Of course, we have terrorism, cyber and hybrid, we have Russia, and we have, of course, the Syria mess and everything else which is on the agenda. So we have real problems to resolve, and we have to make it work, European defense. I remember when, say, 15 years ago, and here I have a good friend of mine, Minister Pașcu, with whom we were twice ministers together at the same time. And we, of course, recall those times when we were then candidate members for the European Union, participated in big meetings, when member states and candidate members, we pledged forces for the European defense, and some countries pledged armies, Bulgaria pledged divisions. It was funny. Nothing of that happened because it was, there was a lack of political will, and the integration process was not developed. And of course, we didn't have the present threats. So we have a different time now. And of course, we have Brexit. And today, Prime Minister Theresa May had a very interesting and very important statement at the Munich conference where she outlined her country's view on how we should continue to cooperate between the EU and the UK when they leave the Union, and it is very important. We have to find a way to cooperate with the Brits. So what needs to be done? First, we have to make strategic autonomy work, strengthening NATO. This will be the trick. We need to strengthen European defense, but at the same time strengthen NATO. The alliance is decades old, and it is still immune to abrupt political change, but we shouldn't test this immunity for a long time. So we have to take care of the concerns of the United States, our major ally, and other allies who are not members of the European Union. Second, we need practical implementation of the strategic autonomy concept, step by step, convincing both our allies and our publics that this is the right way to go. And of course, we should follow three principles. First, coherence in capability developments. Because of the NATO defense planning process, it has to be coherent, it has to be compatible with what we're doing in the European Union. Second, availability, and of course, whatever we do and construct as forces in the European Union, they will have to be capable and available for NATO operations. And three, strongest possible inclusions of non-EU NATO allies, of course, the United States, but also Turkey, Norway, and the United Kingdom. Number three of what shall be done, and I think it's very important, is to bring the EU security and defense debate to the wider public, but I expect my colleagues and Professor Tugave to speak about that, and this is strategic communications. We need the support of our publics a lot. They give us the mandate, they give us the money, so we need the support. And we have to convince them that what we're deciding is not a what we're engaged in is not a theoretical debate about money and capabilities, but it is a debate about solving the problems of the day. Number 4, and I think this is very important, again, I would mention here my friend Minister Pașcu. I believe in that nations in EU and of course in NATO would have to make clusters when they approach common projects in the EU. Because when you engage with countries like-minded of the same position, development of armed forces, etc., and facing same or similar security problems, then you achieve a higher common denominator. And this is very important to be done within the framework of the EU, and this will be possible. And it is envisaged in the EU treaty. In the past, we had the Franco-German, then the British, Franco-British cooperation, etc., etc. So making clusters of interests work within the EU is a good thing to do. And I think it will find its place now in PESCO. And last but not least, I do believe that we need an Article 5 for the European Union. Somebody will say that we already have it in Article 42.7 of the EU Treaty, but this engagement should be made more convincing. It will not happen immediately, but I think if we have shared our financial systems, our social systems, our economic life and everything, we have to be more resolute when we commit to the security of each other, well, like we have it in NATO, without hampering the alliance. And the last word, the good thing for PESCO is that it is not given for granted. If you are not willing to do it, you will be expelled. So this time, nations will have to take care of being truly engaged in this process, and I really hope that it will succeed. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Nov. And now we go to Mr. Tagarev. The floor.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. It's an honor to address such a distinguished audience of members of the European Parliament and national parliaments. In my short introduction, I will raise 3 points, which in my view are of key importance for the development of the European defense. First is the need for cooperation and on some matters close coordination between the European Union and NATO on defense matters. Second is the need to maintain cohesion and the popular support for the European defense across the European Union, which requires proportionate and balanced contribution by and inclusion of all member states. And the third point is that in the proliferation of roles and missions of the armed forces, we need to remember what constitutes the core of the military profession and make sure that the ethos of the military is preserved. On the first point, in the short time since signing the joint declaration in July 2016, defense and security cooperation between the European Union and NATO is both widening and deepening. It is important in guaranteeing interoperability, developing complementary capabilities, and avoiding duplication. In that process, the transatlantic link in this cooperation and the role of NATO remain indispensable in guaranteeing defense of the European continent, the territorial integrity of European states, and in deterring any potential aggressor. To guarantee effective and efficient cooperation between EU and NATO in the future, we need to coordinate defense planning and review procedures, both bureaucratically, that is to guarantee compatibility of method, concepts, terminology, and timeframes, as well as to facilitate cooperation in various domains in terms of roles, levels of ambition, and capabilities developed in the frameworks of the European Union and NATO. My second point is that the drive towards more Europe in defense, as far as I am aware, enjoys a broad popular support. We need to make sure that this support is maintained and the cohesion among member states is preserved. To a large extent, this will depend on how well each member state finds its place in EU defense developments. Key in this respect are the contribution of member states to EU operations and missions, deployable forces in high readiness, what was already mentioned, the EU battle groups as they evolve in the future, contribution to multinational military formations and the development of capabilities more generally, contribution to research and technology development, the defense industrial component, and last but not least, defense expenditure. A process needs to be put in place which provides transparency of involvement and contributions of each member state. And here I will contradict a little bit Minister Noev, who said that it's up to individual states. Yes, that's true, but also I think the European Parliament is in a position to provide such transparency. I would recommend that the European Parliament establishes a process of regular, for example, annual, review of the participation and contribution of member states, and if it is found that one or more member states do not contribute to or is or are excluded from certain component of European defense, the European Parliament may seek to adopt policies and encourage a balanced and more equitable contribution by each member state. And I will conclude by briefly examining the third issue. This is the preservation of the ethos of the armed forces in a time of diversifying roles and fuzzier boundaries. Over time, armed forces of EU member states have been tasked to perform ever-expanding roles. To disaster response and border control, recently we witnessed the addition of counter-terrorism operations at home, operations during mass disorders, roles in providing cybersecurity of critical infrastructures, and hybrid warfare roles such as counter-propaganda and strategic communications. The rationale for such involvement is easy to understand. I will not question it. I would, however, caution that continuous reliance on the military in the performance of such roles may have a negative impact both on law enforcement and other non-military capacities and on the military itself. We should not forget that the core military expertise is in the exercise and/or management of violence in an environment characterized by high degree of risk for the life of soldiers, sailors, and airmen. To preserve the ethos of the armed forces, it is important to maintain the cohesion of the military and not to forget that its primary role is to fight and win wars. In this respect, my recommendation is more towards national parliaments, not to forget this primary role of the military in discussing new roles, recruitment and career models, budget allocation, and so on. Thank you for your attention. I look forward to your questions and the discussion.
Thank you, Mr. Professor. And now I am going to open the floor for our Q&A session. And I am obliged to remind you that according to the rules of the procedures, the length of the speeches may not exceed more than 1.5 minutes, so 90 seconds. And I don't want to be a brutal timekeeper, but I'm gonna use the bell if you exceed this time, just to warn you that you may shorten your speech or question. So, the first question comes from Portugal, Mrs. Isabella Pires. So, please, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, dear colleagues. The discussion about the EU global strategy, NATO cooperation, and the development of the EU military capabilities is very much connected to the discussion held yesterday, although it was short. Being certain that the EU is facing some crisis, especially in what is perceived by the people as what should be the role of the European institutions, I believe, and my party believe, that the focus given to military capabilities and the launch of PESCO is a wrong path. It does not respond to the rise of extreme right-wing movements, and it certainly does not respond to the need of bringing citizens closer to the European project as it is. If we put together the goals of 2% expenditure in NATO countries and the PESCO goals, our countries will obviously have an increase of budget on military and security matters. When we have social issues to respond, such as young unemployment, the need to secure jobs with rights, the need to respond effectively to the humanitarian problems, it's a mistake to focus on maximizing effectiveness in defense expenditures. It sends the wrong message to our citizens. Maybe we could and should be talking about other areas where we could possibly agree on investing in cohesion or on improving the life of our citizens, but not on the military areas. Politically speaking, it says a lot about the state of the European European project when countries are very quick on agreeing on military issues, but there's still not a consensus on implementing humanitarian policies to respond to the refugee crisis, for example? Thank you.
Thank you very much. It is a really interesting question. So it is very old discussion on how to spend the money. So who is going to take this question from the panelists? Mr. Motok, please.
Thank you very much. Thank you for this question. There's first the fact that we are engaging in bringing more Europe on defense and security, because there is a very clear majority support for that expressed by European citizens. They are seeing an unprecedented mix of both conventional challenges. Basically, we are encircled by, at the east, a resumption of military conventional challenges, and to the south by chronic instability and conflicts. On the other hand, we have all this display of asymmetrical challenges ranging from terrorist attacks to cyber attacks, and you name it. So that's what they are seeing for 2 or 3 years now, basically without interruption. We are now at the end of the longest period with no major terrorist strikes on our continent, but I don't think that should make us forget the time when there was no trimester basically without a major terrorist attack, and that should not be seen as sustainable, because I'm afraid it is not. So you have a lot of political legitimacy. In fact, European defense is probably the most popularly backed project that we have right now in the European Union. Budgetary-wise, I guess that the debate is pretty much the same in the domestic setting as it is in Europe. You don't want to contrast military expenditure with other expenditure. To me, the most basic reason for that is that we would not be able to benefit from investments in education, in health, in other directions unless we are safe. Unless we have the means to defend ourselves. The same is true at EU level, and just to give you an indication of the order of magnitude we are having in mind in the next MFF for defense policy, it's 1% of the budget, not of the GDP, not of the aggregated GDP of the EU, but of the EU budget. 1% of what I think Commissioner Oettinger said cost the European taxpayers the price of a cup of coffee per day. So this is 1% of the price of a cup of coffee in order to be able to benefit from the rest of 99% of that said cup of coffee. So I know it's a difficult case to be made, but on the other hand, we should not mix things. You rightly mentioned, for instance, the concern for the social challenges that are still very present on our continent. If we are only to think of the enduring high rates of youth unemployment in several of our member states, just to give an example, but. While we are proceeding towards developing these new policy areas, we're not neglecting social. And one good example is that I'm sure you noted that towards the end of last year was the building up of a true European social pillar that was discussed at the summit in Göteborg. There's a lot we are doing in that direction as well. So it's not exclusive an approach in the approach on the next MFF. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Motok, and some adds from Mr. Ikladi.
Thank you very much. Just 3 very quick points. First, that, as you know, security and defense has become part of our daily life. There is blood in the streets of Europe as a result of terrorist attacks. Some of our countries are exposed to hybrid threats every single day, trying to destabilize countries. undermine trust in governments. So it's a reality. It's an unavoidable reality. Second, I don't think we have the luxury to make a choice between we concentrate on security or concentrate on other issues only. We have to learn how to walk and chew gum at the same time, as the Americans would say. We have to do it all together. Security is important in today's world. We have to devote resources to protect our citizens from the nightmares of these threats. And three, the meaning of defense has been changing, and we are talking about security and defense. We are also talking about intelligence, to be better aware and better prepared for possible terrorist attacks, for instance. We are talking about cyber as well. That's also part of the definition of what defense means. So I think it's broader. It's not just military hardware, not just tanks and aircraft. It's a lot more. It's a lot broader definition. So I think we have to. It is important for our protection, I think.
Thank you, Mr. Icludi. So the second question comes from Spain, Mr. Carlos Rojas. Please, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Mr. Popov, and thank you to the table. We have a lot of challenges in the European Union in terms of security and homeland security, and of course in common foreign and security policy. All those challenges are not possible without an European Union facing more responsibility in the international scene as a global player, speaking with one voice and making and offering common laws to the rest of the world. Our citizens demand a strong Europe, a united Europe, far from nationalism, far from radical politics, and strong against terrorism with all the strength of the democracy. After 60 years of peace in Europe, European Union is the solution. That already has been tasted that way. The practical, loyal relationship with NATO has to be stronger. It's not about weakening NATO or duplicating the work of the alliance. It's about the strengthening Europe and being more efficient. Which is the main step we need in the future in that way? For example, the industry in the Airbus model has been a story of success in Europe. Is that an example for having the goal that we want, an European Union ready to be stronger and stronger in security and defense? We are the opposite of fragmentation, as has been said. We are the opposite of nationalism. We are the union and with the oldest countries in the world. Thank you.
Thank you. And before to start with the answers, I would like to ask our panelists to shorten their answers because we have a lot of questions and we would like to answer all of them. So please be short. So who is going to get? Or absolutely. It was a statement. I think that there is no comments from this table. Okay. Next statement or comments will come from Mrs. Selima Belhash from Netherlands. So.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you for also the presentations. I have to be honest that I'm a little bit worried, although we should be celebrating, although for some political parties, that the European defence cooperation is really going well. But to reflect also on my Portuguese colleague, that's exactly why I'm worried, is that, for instance, my political party is really for the EU defence cooperation. But my other colleague from the Netherlands really doesn't like the EU defence cooperation, which makes me worry because in November 2017 we reaffirmed the need to facilitate the political decision-making on the deployment of the EU battle groups. So the couple of months we will have this debate about how it will function. And I can imagine that in a lot of national parliaments, the debate will be about the fact if the people really want joint deployment. I think it's wise to not underestimate that big debate that each national parliament has to arrange. But I think, first of all, that it's also a task for the EU, because sometimes it feels that it's not clear that we're aiming for that aspect, because there are a lot of almost technical, practical things that needs to be done before addressing the huge topic. So my question is, are we honest and clear enough about aiming at the deployment of the EU battle groups in the end?
Thank you. I think that it's a tough question, because on this table I cannot see the guys who are responsible for that. But Mr. Matok probably...
Yeah, all right.
Oh, who is the first one?
Okay, all right.
Okay.
Yeah, thank you very much. Maybe because the institution or the EU as such was mentioned or addressed by the question, and of course the EU is the member states practically. And let's be clear. So again, as I said, this is the Ferrari in the garage that we have never used, and the reason is clearly and solely political. Nothing more than that. It's only political, because otherwise the concept is there. In the meantime, a lot of polishing is taking place to make it even shinier and even more versatile. Nonetheless, we still don't use it. So we are still in the purgatory, in a way, caught between use it or lose it. We cannot decide losing it, but we haven't been able to use it. Funding is a fundamental question, fundamental problem. This is why hopefully what's further down the road coming up may change. As long as you cannot bring synchron between the interest of the country who keeps the battle group on standby and the concrete case where the troops will have to be deployed, of course, it's increasingly difficult to bridge that gap. So expect a country to deploy somewhere where it has no national interest whatsoever, risk the life of their soldiers, pay for it in full. It's not working. That's clearly the experience. So we need to twist a little bit the whole manual of battle group use to be able to start using it. But still the intent is to keep it. It's a good instrument. We just haven't found the right way of actually activating the potentials of it.
Okay, thanks. Professor Togarev, but please.
I would add that the battle groups have been in existence for nearly 15 years and never used. In my view, that's too bad to ask the military to maintain high level of readiness when they see that no one is willing to use them. One of the major roadblocks to that use was the financing issue. That roadblock is now being removed. So now, in my view, this will be a real test whether we can have a common security and defense policy, even common foreign and security policy or not. And yes, parliaments have a role here because in addition to reflecting views of the people who have voted for them, they have to educate the people and explain why we need this. And I also think that we'll need some sort of indicators to demonstrate to the people in the member states that European defense brings real benefits to them. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So the next question comes from France. Mrs. Bono.
Merci, Monsieur le Président. La coopération UE-OTAN est en effet fondamentale. L'OTAN est aujourd'hui incontournable en matière de défense collective et la France, membre de l'EAS, au sein de l'Alliance, en Estonie l'année dernière et en Lituanie cette année. Je pense toutefois qu'en complément de l'OTAN et compte tenu des spécificités de l'Union européenne, il y a une place pour une PSDC ambitieuse au service de la sécurité de nos concitoyens. Premier point, les crises qui affectent aujourd'hui l'Union européenne ne peuvent être résolues par les seuls moyens militaires. Il faut une action globale, sous une direction unique, incluant des moyens militaires mais aussi civils, financiers et humanitaires dont l'Union est seule à disposer. Deuxième point, si le voisinage oriental est le domaine d'action naturel de l'OTAN, toutes les opérations militaires de l'Union ont été lancées en Afrique, avec notamment la France, la Belgique, l'Italie. L'Union européenne dispose d'une expérience du terrain africain que n'a pas l'OTAN. Troisième point, en matière de lutte contre le terrorisme, une coordination parfaite entre les moyens de sécurité intérieure et les moyens de sécurité extérieure est indispensable. L'Union européenne me semble donc mieux armée que l'OTAN pour mener une lutte qui, si elle a des implications militaires à l'extérieur, se passe aussi dans nos villes et dans nos territoires. Ne pensez-vous pas que la PSDC devrait être aussi tournée vers l'opérationnel et pas seulement vers le capacitaire? Je vous remercie.
Thank you, madam. So, I guess, Mr. Ikludi, oh, no? Some comments on that? No? Okay. We definitely agree with that. So, because we have 35 more minutes, I would like to pack the questions in 4. So I'll get next 4 questions from Mr. Orias Kalnish.
Thank you.
I'm sorry, we're going to have 4 more questions and answers, and following by next 4 questions, so to be able to cover all the questions that we have on the floor. So the first one is Mr. Orias Kalnish, and the second one is Mr. Laurinas Paidokas. The third one is Mr. Andrei Hinko, and the fourth one is Mr. Wolfgang Helminich. So, please.
Okay, thank you very much. I want to thank Gabor Miklodi for raising the military mobility issue, although that was just at the end. I think that needs to be talked about more extensively. The NATO upcoming summit's going to cover at least 2 issues. One is defense spending, which we've talked about extensively, but the other is mobility, or what some call military Schengen. Rapid mobility of troops in Europe right now are inhibited by 2 things. One is lack of infrastructure, bridges, tunnels, viaducts that prevent movement. And second is laws and regulations, long permission times. Obviously, NATO wants to address this issue, but especially in terms of laws and regulations and to some degree infrastructure, isn't this something that the EU should be working on as part of its defense strategy? Like Gabor Miklodi said, having an equipment in the garage is no good if you can't move it anywhere. Because nobody will allow you to. And I think we need to emphasize when we talk about capability, it's not just firepower, but it's getting the firepower where it's needed as quickly as it's needed. Thank you.
So, the next question.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Of course, when we are starting to discuss the future of PESCO, the biggest question is where is the finalité for PESCO? What is the final destination? Does this journey without the map, or do we have a map? And from my point of view, what PESCO should not to do? First of all, of course, not to duplicate NATO, and any move to EU as a defense union will raise the risks of NATO duplications. Also, what should not PESCO do is to create the situations when member states would be pushed to choose between EU and NATO, for example, in military procurement process. And of course, PESCO should not be used as a tool for creating federal Europe. But what PESCO can do, and I absolutely agree with my Latvian colleague, PESCO should enhance EU security and defense capabilities, including through improvement of military mobility, countering hybrid threats, enhancing cybersecurity. Enhancing cross-border military mobility is a priority for our region. Swift movement of personnel and assets to the area where they are needed is essential for large-scale rapid deployments. So we are very glad that military mobility was included into the new set of proposals for increased EU-NATO cooperation. Thank you very much.
Thank you. And now we... Mr. Andrei Hunko, so please.
Ich möchte erst meinen Protest zum Ausdruck bringen, wie hier debattiert wird. Ich finde, es geht nicht, es ist eine interparlamentarische Konferenz, dass wir Abgeordneten hier auf 90 Sekunden begrenzt werden, dass unsere Beiträge kommentiert werden vom Chair und sozusagen dann beliebig lange darauf reagiert werden kann. Also ich fand auch den Umgang mit dem ersten Beitrag der portugiesischen Kollegin, den ich völlig teile, inakzeptabel für Parlamentarier. Ich will mich dem auch anschließen. Ich habe konkrete Fragen an drei auf dem Podium, an Herrn Iklodi, zu den Battlegroups. Welche konkreten Einsatzvorstellungen haben Sie? Wo könnten diese Battlegroups eingesetzt werden? Und Herrn Motoc möchte ich fragen, wie kann man verhindern, dass es diesen Missbrauch gibt zwischen der Vermischung von Cyberattacken, was ja ein terroristischer Anschlag ist einerseits, und Fake News andererseits. Das sind ja völlig verschiedene Sphären, die werden aber oft in der Darstellung ineinander gemischt. Und drittens die letzte Frage an Herrn Noev zur EU-NATO-Kooperation. Wie gehen wir mit dem Problem um, dass es ja auch viele Mitgliedstaaten in der Europäischen Union gibt, die strikte Neutralität in ihrer Verfassung haben? Vielen Dank.
Thank you, sir. And the last of the four is Mr. Wolfgang Helmicke.
Ja, Herr Präsident, vielen Dank, dass ich hier das Wort ergreifen kann. Ich möchte mich auf 3 Punkte konzentrieren. Erfreulich an der Diskussion über die PESCO und die stärkere Kooperation zwischen der NATO und der EU ist ja das Ergebnis, dass auch auf der anderen Seite des Atlantiks geteilt wird, dass es in der Tat keine Verdopplung von Strukturen gibt, sondern dass es sich gegenseitig ergänzende Strukturen gibt. Das hat uns ein ganzes Stück vorwärts gebracht. Ich nehme das Beispiel, das gerade auch angesprochen wird, Mobilität. Der Aufbau eines Logistik-Hub für die NATO hat natürlich genauso gut seinen Benefit für die EU und für das, was wir im Bereich der Verteidigungsfähigkeit und Stärkung der EU an der Stelle tun. Das sind, glaube ich, die richtigen Beispiele, wie das auch vorangehen muss. Der zweite Punkt, wir haben noch nicht eingeblendet das Thema der industriellen Basis, wo wir Europa erhebliche Überkapazitäten haben. Wir haben in den deutsch-französischen Vereinbarungen eine Festlegung getroffen, dass die Wertschöpfung bei den Projekten, die wir tun, dort anfällt, in den Ländern, in denen es auch die entsprechenden Fähigkeiten gibt. Die Frage, nach welchen Regeln wird dieses an anderer Stelle getan? Und ich möchte einen dritten Punkt aufnehmen, den Frau Mogherini gestern ganz zum Schluss ihrer Rede als Wunsch geäußert hat, nämlich die Stärkung der zivilen Dimension dessen, was die EU an Instrumenten entwickelt, mit der Aufforderung, sich dort sehr stark zu konzentrieren. Gibt es einen Plan oder eine Vorstellung, die in Richtung Aufbau ziviler Dimension geht, der EU, der vielleicht mit der neuen Vereinbarung à la PESCO endet?
So, who is going to take the floor first? Probably Mr. Noev, yes.
Thank you, Chairman. There was a question addressed to me, my opinion on EU-NATO cooperation in view that there are a number of neutral non-aligned states in the European Union. That's a very valid question, and I think it's been addressed by national parliaments in those countries. And I think that at least 2 of them, let's say Sweden and Finland, they're very seriously considering changing their neutrality status or at least moving something in this direction. Of course, we respect their choice, but they will have to choose. And it's up to their people to decide. But at this point, we see no conflict of their neutrality in participation in NATO-related activities up to the level allowed by their constitutional arrangements. So I'll leave this option or this issue open, and we would very much like to welcome the neutral states in our allied structures. Thank you.
Thank you, and Mr. Ikludi.
Thank you very much. Just in a telegraphical style, starting with the possible use of the battle groups. The concept has a pretty clear description what it can be used for. Concretely, where it has come up as a very useful tool was, for instance, back in 2014 in the Central African Republic. Very defined task, limited in scope, limited in geography. Battle groups, according to the concept, are a sort of entry force, limited in time between 30 and 120 days. The UN is extremely interested to use that model of a bridging operation, as they call it, also in the future. The UN has proven to be very slow in deployment of larger contingents. And the EU, despite of not being able to use a battle group, and despite of relatively long fourth generation, could deploy relatively quickly. So that's a concept that the UN is very much in support of. Another possible use is, for instance, evacuation of our personnel people if the situation turns very hostile in a region. But the range is rather wide. On civilian capabilities, efforts are underway. The concept is being developed. Soon it will be approved among member states according to the plans. And then the development of, similarly to the military side, similarly the capability development process will start. And by the end of the year, according to the plan, there should be a compact that also commits member states to make those resources available, which is a critical issue on the civilian field. Just to say one more word on this, this is, of course, critical not only to counterbalance the current defense-related efforts and show that, that the EU is not militarizing, but also we need to draw on EU's unique strength, which lies precisely in the fact that it can use a wide toolbox, which includes both civilian and military. And lastly, on military mobility, mostly EU issue, to a large degree, I agree in terms of, for instance, solving both sets of issues, the diplomatic and procedural, if I may call them so, and also the infrastructural, that is how to link up with ongoing Commission efforts, TEN-T project, which is well underway, to include also military requirements. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. And what I understood, Mr. Motok wants to say a few words.
Well, thank you. Just to pick up from the last remark of colleague Iklodi on military mobility, indeed, particularly on infrastructural adjustment needs to allow the swift passage of military equipment throughout our European Union. There is determination on the part of the Commission to come by April with a communication on military mobility. What I can say right now is that we have a relatively good view, good picture of what these needs exactly are. They are well defined, and we also have a relatively good understanding of how much this would cost. I can say that it's not unsurmountable amounts. The question ahead of us, and especially since we're looking at the MFF negotiation, the big question is whether you finance that under infrastructure policy or under defense policy, which is not an easy one, and I don't have a definitive answer to that. But military mobility is coming up in importance. It's important for NATO, it's important for the EU, it's important for many member states. To the point that was made by the distinguished MP from Germany who spoke first, Well, I hope I didn't. I totally agree that there is a need to keep separate cyber challenges and fake news. Although, as you, I think, also indicated that they might come together, overlap as part of the same incident or of the same operation. But I just mentioned the two together because they are among all threats that we are confronted with. These are threats that everyone experienced in the European Union. I didn't suggest more than that commonality. And if I can also make a point with regard to EU-NATO, I'd say that the question raised by the distinguished MP from Lithuania and from Lithuania, I'd say first that as a Romanian, I honestly wouldn't have accepted to work on European defense if I had the slightest suspicion that we're undermining in any way the role of NATO, or even if I suspected that we are overlapping. Probably the best guarantee that it's almost inconceivable to have a contradiction between what NATO and the EU are aiming at is the fact that there's 22 nations that belong to both organizations and which are not going to divide their expectations and their attitude towards the two organizations. These are different organizations, but they are no strangers to one another. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Motok. So, we are going to proceed with the second package of 4 questions, and the first one of them comes from Latvia, Mr. Yanis Dombrava.
Dear members of European and national parliaments, EU defense cooperation is important, especially if we are looking at hybrid and information warfare. We see war and hate propaganda coming from Russian TV channels, and they reach Russian-speaking population of Europe. And indeed, many Russian-speaking people believe this propaganda. They indeed believe that West is their enemy, which should be destroyed. And in Ukraine, fascists are in power who wants to kill all of Russians. Eastern European countries are struggling to close retranslation of these channels because they are protected by legislation of some of European Union countries. Our National Electronic Media Council have sent many proof of hate and war propaganda in Russian TV channels to Sweden and other countries where these channels are registered. Yet we don't receive action from them. Total ignorance. This issue should be solved. One way is to change European Audiovisual Media Directive, which protects retranslation of these propaganda channels. And that is jobs that the EU should do to counter hybrid warfare. Concrete job that we can do, and I hope it will be done.
Thank you, Mr. Dobra. And now we go to Mr. Szymon Welcech from Poland.
Thank you, Chair. EU-NATO daily cooperation has become a normal practice. However, as PESCO materializes, we need to make sure that it doesn't become inward-looking. The EU-NATO cooperation must be built into the logic of PESCO. The focus of NATO-EU agenda should be maintaining the right balance between countering hybrid threats and fighting terrorism. Assisting our closest partners in defense capacity building and resilience remains important for us all. Bosnia and Herzegovina, Moldova, Tunisia have been identified as potential recipient partner countries. Ukraine and Georgia also need to be included. We need more visible projects. Our partners want to see that EU-NATO cooperation works on the ground. We should continue supporting investments in the security of the EU and its neighbors through strengthening the common security and defense policy. As today, Polish Prime Minister said during the conference in Munich, we don't need only think tanks, we also need steel tanks. Permanent structured cooperation should increase EU defense capabilities while acknowledging NATO as a guarantor of collective defense. For us, NATO remains the organizer of defense in Europe. I support fully the voice of my Lithuanian and Latvian colleagues about the need to fight the Russian propaganda. That's why we highly appreciate the initiatives undertaken by the EU East Stratcom Task Force. However, in its present formula, it is not capable to effectively counter disinformation, propaganda and fake news. The optimal solution would consist of setting up similar units in all countries. Thank you.
Just on time, thanks. And next one is Mr. Pașcu, the Vice President of the European Parliament.
Well, thank you very much. Thank you, Boyko, for the nice words. It seems that there is in the relationship between NATO and EU and NATO, it's a chicken and egg problem. Because, you know, on the one hand, if we want to strengthen EU defense and security, then, you know, the American administration might become suspicious. And particularly this American administration, in spite of the fact that the Americans have requested this from Europe. And therefore, this is strengthening our decision to strengthen even further our defense. So if we do that we get into this spiral, because we do not discuss here only facts, we discuss also perceptions. And in this respect, you know, I would like to ask the panel if there is a means to really eliminate this suspicion and in order to allow us to benefit of this strategic autonomy. And strategic autonomy should be clearly defined. If we don't do that, then everybody would understand whatever they want, and this is not good for the relationship between the two. It means, you know, a capacity to take decisions, but also the capacity to implement them without weakening NATO. How can we do that? Thank you.
Thank you very much. And the last but not the least from this package is Mrs. Norica Nicolai from the European Parliament.
Thank you, Chair. Last year when European launched PESCO, I hope that was not a reaction to the position of the President Trump in the NATO summit. Because on me, PESCO is not only about the procurement, only about the put together the capability to buy from the European, not from the American, because we know that we are really different in terms of capability, which be very difficult to have the same type of military capability for us. For me, PESCO is about the new threats without border and about the necessity to have a common answer, if we are able to have this answer, or to support member states to have this answer. One of the important traits is this fake news, who in terms of costs are cheaper to be done, but the effect are really can be really a disaster. Do you think the European Union have a common approach to tackle the issue of fake news, or is necessary to support member states to develop different body in order to tackle this difficult issue? Thank you.
Thank you very much, ma'am. So, Professor Tagarev, please.
Thank you. I'll try to answer the question posed by Professor Pașcu. I already mentioned that in my introductory remarks that whatever the European Union does in the field of defense needs to be transparent to everyone who is an important stakeholder in the process. And obviously NATO and our North American allies are clearly a stakeholder in the process. That transparency can be achieved by using common concepts, methods of planning procedures, and to coordinate in time the planning processes, the review process, and so on. And if we go further, but here you may see me as a bit naive, not being in politics, not having experience in politics, is actually there needs to be a discussion on levels of ambition in terms of territorial defense operations outside the European Union and all these gray zones of cyber, hybrid, counter-terrorist operations along the borders, migration, and so on. This may not solve the problem and eliminate suspicion, but at least will create a more favorable ground for transparent and open discussion.
Thank you, Professor. Mr. Iklodi, please.
Thank you very much. Maybe starting with the question about providing visible proofs that the EU-NATO cooperation works in practice in the field. And indeed, we have been running these 3 pilots. Georgia and Ukraine are next on the list, and there are also similar initiatives in the south, like in Jordan. In some areas, visibility in itself provides a strength. So for instance, if in Ukraine or Georgia there are joint EU-NATO efforts, that shows that we stay united, and our messaging and the training efforts, whatever we provide, is done together. In other areas, it's more sensitive. So for instance, in Tunisia, it is proving a little bit more difficult. On Stratcom and East and Task Force East, they are doing really a fantastic job. In particular, if you take that into account that we are talking about merely a dozen colleagues working on this, and with a budget of 200,000 euros per year. And if you consider the side that needs to be balanced out through that effort, then it's quite a challenge. It is an open question. What is the right solution? Probably it's a combination of member states developing their own Stratcom capacities. Of course, they cannot tackle these problems alone. So there is need for coordination, cooperation among them. And of course, there is need to develop a central capacity. And we are doing that together with NATO as well. So that's yet another area of cooperation. On strategic autonomy, that's indeed a huge challenge ahead. And you saw, I think, in the run-up to the NATO Defense Ministerial, the press statements and others from the US raising doubts about the direction of travel in Europe. It has a capability development and an operational aspect to it as well. It's a challenge. It requires constant consultations and transparency about this. But one thing is very clear. I mean, all the defense-related efforts have the responsibility and the task to reinforce the European defense industrial base, to create one and reinforce it. So we can package it different ways, but that's very clearly an intention, and thus create a more even playing field. Yeah, I think that's it. Thank you.
Thank you, Gabor. So, Mr. Motok.
Yes, thank you. To just add to what Director Iklodi said about the valiant efforts of the East Stratcom task force that the ES is running, agreeing with the points made by the Latvian and Polish MP entirely. I think the figures are 14 experts, which who in over a period of 2 years managed to do 3,500 pushbacks from Russian-inspired pieces of propaganda, to the point that now we have developed some immunity towards propaganda from that direction, but we are yet to invent to come with some Stratcom that would address other sources of pernicious interference, ideological interference, which are not missing from out there. Now, of course, on NATO, EU, perhaps, and the US, our strategic partner in this process, I'm, of course, bowing to the chicken and egg metaphor. It's there. I'd just like to say what President Juncker said this morning in München, he recalled that actually the U.S. called on us to do more to cater for our own security. In fact, President Trump was only the fourth American president to make that statement. Maybe he made it a little bit more markedly, but he was only the fourth in a row. Obviously, this is not the only reason why we're undertaking European defense and security. First and foremost is the challenges we are confronted with for some time. And I would say also to echo the points made earlier by the distinguished French MP, there is no confusion of roles here. We are not going to do collective defense. We are saying that very explicitly, but between collective defense, Article 5 of the NATO treaty, and what we are currently doing, namely low-intensity crisis management, and we're not doing anything else. In between the two, there's a lot of threats and a lot of missions to address those threats, and somebody has to take them up. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. And because we have 6 more minutes, we're going to take the last 2 questions. The first one comes from Iceland. Ms. Rosa Björg Brynjolfsdóttir. I apologize myself.
Thank you, Chair. I would like to emphasize on Madame Mogherini's words yesterday that the original DNA of the EU is peace and reconciliation, and on the specific European way of defense. And of course, on necessarily and vital mix of soft power with the hard power. And I must admit, maybe as a member of a NATO nation without an army, and maybe as a member of a left-green feminist party, I miss sorely in these discussions more emphasis on peaceful resolution through vital civil service, much more gender balance in discussion and decision-making in defense issues, but moreover, more emphasis on social reform and social justice, the fight against inequality, poverty and corruption in our neighbor countries, and also here within our European countries, and also on the education, media literacy, as Mr. Motok mentioned in his words. And the reason why I mention and emphasize all this, and call me naive, is that this is absolutely vital and necessary to increase the importance of soft power, especially regarding cyber defense, false news, and suspicion on meddling with democratic election, but also in peacekeeping and humanitarian aid when we talk about EU military strategy. And I would be most grateful to have some real comments on these issues from the panelists. Thank you.
Thank you very much, ma'am. And the second question comes from Spain. Mr. José Cruz Pérez Lapazaran. Please, sir.
Sí, muchas gracias, señor presidente. Felicitar a todos los ponentes. Yo quisiera decir que en nuestro país se ha creado una comisión mixta Congreso-Senado dentro de la Comisión de Seguridad Nacional sobre ciberseguridad en España. Esto demuestra el interés que despierta en nuestro país y el interés que tenemos en mejorar tanto la ciberseguridad en nuestro país como cooperar en mejorar la colectiva de la Unión Europea. Y quisiera transmitir algunas de las cuestiones que nos preocupan y trasladarles alguna propuesta. En una comparecencia en esta comisión que se creó, un centro acreditado por la OTAN nos dijo muchas cosas sobre la guerra de la información y de la desinformación y de las amenazas que se venían produciendo tanto en la Unión Europea y en el mundo, sobre todo procedentes de robots y de algún país que donde residen precisamente estos robots. El señor Motok ya ha dicho de la importancia, la influencia que pueden tener estos ciberataques, pero yo añado algo que es importante, y es que el 90% de todas las redes sociales están relacionadas con algún robot que hay en el mundo. Y la importancia la hemos visto, y hoy mismo en algunos periódicos de mi país se decía que Estados Unidos destapa la fábrica de noticias falsas y acusa a 13 rusos por la injerencia electoral. Empleaban a cientos de personas a través de redes sociales y el activismo de base desplegó en Estados Unidos una intensa campaña de intoxicación política. Es decir, máxima importancia a la ciberinteligencia y combate a la desinformación. Pero esto se debe hacer desde una perspectiva común. El señor Motok ha dicho de mancomunar esfuerzos, pero habría que preguntarle quién, cómo y qué podemos hacer desde los parlamentos nacionales. Nada más y muchas gracias.
Thank you, sir. I guess the first question, Mr. Motor will answer.
Well, I'll try at least partially. It was a very useful recall of, among other things, from the MP from Iceland of soft power. From my perspective, one of the stakes for us, for what we're doing on European defense is precisely to be able to secure, to keep the soft power attractiveness of Europe. In a world where this is mostly done, soft power projection, it's done by powers which can back that soft power with some hard power capabilities, and I think we need to have the same combination ourselves in a world where if you look at the military expenditures, we are certainly lagging far behind what's done. If you look at the fact that most of the economic powerhouses are also military powers, if you look at the fact that foreign policy is coming more and more with military arguments behind some stance. So we need to be there in order to be able to continue to play with this uniquely valuable soft power of ours. And I cannot but agree with the points that were made with regard to cyber attack and fake attacks and fake news by the gentleman from Spain, and especially with his last point on the need to unite our efforts to see how we are dealing with that. Indeed, at the level of the European Union, we're only looking into how we can complement the major contribution in this field, which cannot be but member states. And we are seeing this kind of work in partnership not only with member states but also directly and the most intensely possible involvement of journalists, of fact checkers, and of course private sector.
Thanks, sir. Mr. Neuf, just a few words.
I wanted to thank you for, again, for this interesting debate, and for people who are not members of parliament. We are humble. I'm humbled to be among colleagues who expressed interesting opinion, and in fact they were the panel and we were the participants. On soft power, it's absolutely important, but this is something which is part of solidarity. There are allied countries who are in regions where they feel the need for soft power stronger than allied countries which feel the need for hard power. And we had a joke earlier back before the Berlin Wall fell down. A local leader here was quoted as saying that he would exchange geographical position for neutral policy. So yes, we have to respect each other's perception about security threats. Thank you.
Thanks, sir. And just 2 sentences.
I'll try also to respond to the question posed by the Member of Parliament of Iceland. Defense has been for so long taken a secondary role, secondary stage, or even a non-issue in the European Union, that now we enjoy talking about defense, and this was the purpose of this panel. That doesn't mean we do not understand the need to combine hard power and soft power instruments. And we didn't go to sufficient detail, but I'm aware that there have been discussions to have some of the battle groups or portions of the battle groups dedicated to type of security sector reform, defense institution building, training issues, so that not being able to solve all the social problems of the host country, at least they can help local countries take care themselves about what they do. And I personally support this idea to have portions of the battle groups or one of the 2 battle groups dedicated to this mission. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Professor. And last 2 sentences from Mr. Ikludi.
Yeah, thank you. Simply to say that I fully agree, of course, with the point that European Union is a lot more than concentrating, and even the discussion indeed has focused on defense capabilities in the first place. But the European Union is primarily about soft power. It's governance, it's rule of law, it's development assistance. And if we combine these efforts more, then obviously our efforts will be more effective in the world, including the way we spend our development money. So this is why civilian capabilities are so much in the focus. And just one last word on cyber. This is very clearly an area which is certainly not the sole playground for governments. This is industry, civil society, everybody taken together. And in particular, just to mention one point on industry, not only because they are giving us the technology that we use and they are the first line of defense, but they are the ones who design the future, the technological future. And if we, governments, want to take the right decisions today with effect on tomorrow, then obviously we are very well advised to work with them a lot more.
So, with this, we conclude this session, and I'd like to thank you very much to everyone for the questions, for the statements, and definitely I'd like to thank to all panelists, and I'm absolutely sure that they really deserve, and please join me for a round of applause for all of them. Thank you, gents. Now we're gonna have a coffee break, and please be back in 15:15-ish.